What if the world you know is only a fragment of what could have been? In the quiet corridors of forgotten history lie inventions so strange, so powerful, they might have reshaped human destiny, if only they'd been allowed to exist. These aren't wild theories whispered on the fringes. They're stories rooted in real blueprints, documented tests, and men and women who dared to think differently and paid the price. Our journey begins with a question. What happens when a technology threatens not failure, but overwhelming success? Success so vast it disrupts entire industries, shifts global power, and dismantles the very systems that profit from scarcity and control. Throughout the 20th century, and even before, inventors around the world uncovered phenomena that challenged accepted science. Energy drawn from thin air. Machines that levitate against gravity's pull. Therapies that claim to reverse terminal illnesses with frequency alone. Transportation without fuel. Weather controlled by mind and metal. Each idea, when unveiled, glimmered with the promise of a new age. And then, silence. Research buried. Laboratories dismantled. Patents seized or classified. Sometimes the inventors themselves disappeared into history's margins, labeled frauds or lunatics, or simply erased. But the stories didn't vanish. They survived in fragments, in lost documents, obscure interviews, court records, and whispered recollections. In each is a trace of something that might have changed everything. There's Nikola Tesla, standing atop a cliff in Long Island, watching his Wardenclyffe Tower pulse with invisible power. He envisioned a world electrified not by wires or combustion, but by resonance with the Earth itself. Power drawn freely from the planet's own rhythms. The technology worked. Lights glowed without cords. Motors spun in the open air. But when financiers realized they couldn't sell a meter for free energy, the tower came down. And with it, perhaps, our clean energy future. Or Dr. Royal Rife, whose microscope peered deeper than anyone had seen before, into the very spark of life and disease. His frequency generator, they say, cured cancer without a scalpel or pill. But what would happen to an industry built on endless treatment if illness could be harmonized out of existence? The answer was swift and merciless. Labs raided, records vanished, and reputations ruined. These are not isolated tales. They form a pattern, a quiet war not of ideologies but of permission. Not about what can be done, but what will be allowed, and more hauntingly, what must be forgotten. This documentary is not about confirming every claim or proving every machine. It is about the questions we stopped asking, the paths never taken, the futures we were denied. Over the next 13 chapters, we'll trace 10 impossible inventions and the strange, often tragic stories behind them. From engines that run on sound waves to levitating stones in Florida's moonlight, to a ship that vanished from one port and reappeared in another. Each story begins with a spark of possibility and ends in quiet suppression. In the end, this isn't just about science or secrets. It's about us, about how the world might look if curiosity were allowed to lead, unchained by profit or fear. So ask yourself, what else have we forgotten? And more importantly, what might still be waiting to be remembered? It began with lightning in the air, but no storm on the horizon. In the late 1890s, Nikola Tesla stood on the windswept coast of Long Island, gazing up at the iron skeleton of his towering experiment, the Wardenclyffe Tower. It rose like a dream against the sky, a lattice of steel designed not to broadcast radio or spark fireworks, but to do something far more audacious: deliver free energy to the entire planet, wirelessly. Tesla's idea was breathtaking in its elegance. He believed the Earth itself was an electrical conductor, a natural reservoir of limitless power. His tower would send vibrations through the planet's own electric field, allowing anyone with a receiver tuned to the right frequency to draw energy directly from the air. No wires, no fuel, no cost. And it worked. Witnesses described light bulbs glowing miles away from the tower, untethered to any power source. Motors hummed to life without combustion. Heat radiated in homes that had never been connected to any grid. This was not mere theory, it was demonstration. But in the shadows, others were watching. Not scientists or visionaries. Financiers. Titans of industry. Men like J.P. Morgan, who had invested in Tesla's dream only to recoil when he realized its full implications. "If anyone can draw on the power," Morgan reportedly asked, "where do we put the meter?" The answer, of course, was nowhere. And so the dream began to collapse. Funding vanished. The tower was dismantled. By 1917, it stood no more, demolished under the pretense of national security. When Tesla died decades later in a small New York hotel, federal agents seized over 80 trunks of his papers. The patents for free energy transmission disappeared behind a veil of classification that remains unlifted to this day. The story didn't end with Tesla. In 1957, a lesser-known engineer named Lester Hendershot managed to build a working model of Tesla's radiant energy system. He demonstrated it to military officials. Days later, his lab was raided. His device disappeared, and he was warned, in no uncertain terms, to remain silent. To this day, more than 5,000 patents related to energy generation remain sealed under the Inventions Secrecy Act. Most of them deal with technologies that could upend the fossil fuel economy. The pattern is clear. When energy becomes abundant, it becomes uncontrollable. When it becomes uncontrollable, it becomes unprofitable. Tesla's vision wasn't simply technical. It was revolutionary, a world powered not by scarcity, but by abundance. A world where the flow of energy was like air or sunlight, shared, unowned, unlimited. What might our world look like if Tesla's tower still stood? If every home, every village, every remote outpost could draw its own power from the earth itself? We'll never truly know. But perhaps the more unsettling question is not what was lost, but who ensured it would never be found again, and what other futures were buried along with it. It started with a lens unlike any other, one that could see the invisible dance of life. In the 1930s, Dr. Royal Raymond Rife developed a microscope so powerful, so precise, that it revealed living viruses in motion, not as dead smears on slides, but as pulsing reactive entities. It defied what conventional optics deemed possible, achieving magnifications over 60,000 times. But Rife didn't stop at seeing. He wanted to heal. What he discovered was nothing short of astonishing. Each virus, he claimed, had a unique electromagnetic signature, a resonant frequency. If one could identify that frequency, it could be used against the virus, vibrating it into destruction without harming surrounding cells. It was, he said, the principle of the opera singer and the wine glass. Match the right note, and the structure shatters. Rife built machines to emit these frequencies. He called them frequency generators, and when tested in clinical settings, the results were stunning. In 1934, under supervision from respected doctors and researchers, 16 terminal cancer patients were treated. 14 were pronounced cured within 2 months. The remaining 2 followed soon after. It was a breakthrough that should have changed everything, but it didn't. Before the trials could be published, Dr. Milbank Johnson, the physician overseeing the research, died suddenly. The lab was shut down, records vanished, and Rife's promising technology was thrust into the realm of silence. The American Medical Association, under the leadership of Morris Fishbein, began a campaign to discredit Rife. Articles were buried, research grants disappeared. Doctors using Rife's machines were threatened with the loss of their licenses, and in 1939, Rife's lab was raided. His equipment, including his priceless universal microscope, was destroyed. Rife's personal and professional life unraveled. He spent his final years battling legal assaults and watching his life's work erased from public memory. Why? Perhaps because his invention didn't just heal, it disrupted. Rife's frequency therapy required no drugs, no radiation, no invasive procedures. It promised a world where chronic illness was not managed for profit, but cured with vibration and precision. It threatened an industry that had grown vast and powerful on the economics of prolonged treatment. Pharmaceutical empires, hospital networks, research institutions, all reliant not on cures, but on continuity. And yet, traces of Rife's work persist in the shadows, in fringe laboratories, underground clinics, and among those who believe that sound itself can heal. But what if Rife had been celebrated instead of silenced? What if hospitals today hummed not with machines that poison and burn, but with harmonics that restore? Would cancer still haunt every family? Would chronic illness remain an inevitable burden? Or would we be living in a different medical era, one tuned to the quiet frequencies of health? As we look back on Rife's vanished vision, we're left with a haunting thought. Maybe the cure wasn't lost. Maybe it was hidden. It moved, but without wings, without wheels, without sound. In the year 1928, a young physicist named Thomas Townsend Brown stumbled upon something strange. While experimenting with high-voltage capacitors, he observed that the devices seemed to move, ever so slightly, toward their positive terminal. At first, he thought it was error, an illusion, but the movement persisted. It defied conventional physics. It defied gravity. This was the birth of electrogravitics, the science of manipulating gravity using electrical fields. Brown would spend the next decades refining this phenomenon. By the early 1950s, he demonstrated flying discs, not models, but hovering machines, that moved in silence, without propellers or fuel. They glided on fields of voltage, drawing thrust from invisible interactions between mass and electricity. Military observers were intrigued, so intrigued, in fact, that projects codenamed Winter Haven and Project Y were initiated in secrecy. Brown's craft were tested under classified conditions. Reports described disc-shaped vehicles reaching speeds in the hundreds of miles per hour, requiring no combustion, no moving parts, only electricity. The implications were staggering. Aircraft that never needed fuel, spacecraft that could escape Earth's gravity without a rocket, silent flight, instant lift. But in 1956, everything changed. The research was abruptly classified under national security directives. Brown's patents were seized. His work disappeared behind locked doors. Electrogravitics, once on the verge of transforming transportation and space travel, was declared a dead end. The official explanation was simple: it didn't work. But insiders whispered another truth. Aviation magazines at the time reported that aerospace companies like Lockheed and Boeing had quietly absorbed Brown's ideas into next-generation military projects. The so-called failure of electrogravitics, it seems, was not failure at all, but concealment. Why? Because technology that nullifies gravity doesn't just fly. It disrupts everything. It renders jet fuel obsolete. It makes airports primitive. It unravels the entire infrastructure of transportation, energy, and even war. Such power in the wrong hands, or in any hands, would be a geopolitical earthquake. Brown died in 1985, still barred from speaking publicly about his work. What he discovered remains locked behind secrecy orders, its potential buried in defense labs and classified hangars. But what if it hadn't been silenced? What if we could commute on silent levitating craft, unbound by roads or rails? What if space travel didn't require billions in rocket fuel, but a generator and a field? Could we be living among the stars? Or is anti-gravity already here, hidden, waiting, withheld? In Brown's quiet revolution, the sky was not the limit. It was the beginning. And somewhere, behind the veil, that future might still be hovering, just out of reach. It began with a hum, not of machines but of music. In 1872, in a modest Philadelphia workshop, John Ernst Worrell Keely unveiled a motor that seemed to defy physics. It didn't burn coal, consume steam, or require electricity. Instead, it ran on vibrations. Not just any vibrations, but finely tuned sound frequencies, harmonics, he claimed, that resonated with the fabric of matter itself. Keely called it sympathetic vibration. His motor, when activated by musical tones, would lift heavy weights, turn flywheels, and drive mechanical systems. No fuel, no emissions. Just sound and motion. As if music itself had been harnessed into mechanical power. To onlookers, it seemed like magic. Giant machinery sprang to life with nothing more than the strike of a tuning fork. Weights danced on air, pistons pulsed to invisible rhythms. Keely described it as drawing power from the etheric field, the latent energy woven into all matter. Investors were captivated. The Keely Motor Company was founded, and for a brief moment it appeared the world stood at the dawn of a new energy era, one not of combustion but resonance. But then questions began to surface. Keely was notoriously secretive. He refused to reveal the full inner workings of his device, fearing sabotage or theft. Investors grew uneasy. Demands for disclosure turned into legal threats, and as quickly as it rose, the dream began to fracture. By the 1880s, Keely faced lawsuits and accusations of fraud. After his death in 1898, skeptics claimed to find hidden air compressors in his lab, pointing to them as proof that his machines were elaborate hoaxes. But many of these debunkings were funded by the very same financial interests that had once stood to lose everything if Keely's motor proved real. Some modern researchers have quietly questioned the official narrative. They point to aspects of his work that eerily align with discoveries in quantum resonance and zero-point energy, principles unknown in Keely's time but accepted now on the fringes of physics. Could it be that Keely tapped into something real, but simply beyond the understanding of his century? Was his crime not deception, but premature discovery? Today, the idea of extracting energy from the quantum vacuum, from the subtle oscillations of the universe itself, is no longer science fiction. It's speculative science, cautiously explored in academic papers and experimental labs, and yet the Keely motor remains a ghost. What if he had been embraced instead of ridiculed? Protected instead of prosecuted? What would an energy economy built on harmony rather than heat look like? Could cities run on sound? Could machines hum instead of roar? In a world deafened by engines and emissions, Keely offered a quieter promise. That power need not be extracted violently, but coaxed gently from the hidden music of matter. And if that music was once heard, might it still be playing, waiting for us to listen again? It was a laboratory unlike any other, not sterile and clinical, but wild, chaotic, alive with strange forces. In 1979, deep in the heart of Vancouver, Canadian inventor John Hutchison stumbled upon something extraordinary. While experimenting with overlapping electromagnetic fields, Tesla coils, Van de Graaff generators, radio frequency transmitters, he created conditions where the known laws of physics began to falter. Metal bars floated in mid-air, objects fused together, wood merged with steel, aluminum twisted like taffy, materials levitated, transmuted, vibrated without heat or contact. It was as if reality itself had softened, warped, and briefly become something else. He called it the Hutchison effect. At first, he didn't fully understand what he had triggered. It was a fluke, a perfect storm of fields and frequencies that produced anomalies no textbook could explain. But as he refined his setup, the phenomena returned, and witnesses, credible ones, began to take notice. Military officials from both the United States and Canada visited his lab. Scientists observed the levitations and fusions firsthand. One U.S. colonel reported seeing matter behave in ways that defied known physics, calling it genuine and unexplainable. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. In 1990, Hutchison's equipment was seized by Canadian authorities. His documentation vanished. His lab was shut down. The official reason? Electromagnetic interference with aviation equipment. But insiders suspected something deeper. Hutchison's discoveries had implications that rattled the foundations of material science and military engineering. If electromagnetic fields could alter matter at the atomic level, not with heat or force, but with resonance, what did that mean for weapons development? For manufacturing? For reality itself? Rumors swirled that black-budget military programs had quietly replicated his work. Some even speculated that elements of the Hutchison effect had been integrated into advanced aerospace and defense technologies, technologies that remain deeply classified. Hutchison himself continued his research in exile, often with crude equipment and under constant scrutiny. His later experiments, released in grainy video clips, became fodder for skeptics and believers alike. But whether misunderstood genius or accidental profit, the effect that bore his name refused to be dismissed. Imagine a world where gravity could be suspended at will, where elements could be fused or transformed without pressure or heat, where matter was not fixed but fluid, subject to frequency and field. The Hutchison effect suggests that our universe may be more malleable than we think, and that reality itself might respond to harmonics, to fields carefully aligned, to energy dancing in unknown patterns. What if the laws of physics aren't broken in such moments, but merely bent briefly by hands that don't yet know what they're touching? And if one man, working alone, could brush against that mystery, what might we discover if we dared to follow where he left off? It looked like a wooden box, simple, unassuming, but inside, it pulsed with something invisible. In the 1940s, psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich introduced a device he claimed could concentrate a life force that pervades all of nature, what he called Orgone energy. To the scientific world, it sounded like fantasy, but to Reich, it was as real as wind or gravity. And he believed it could heal the human body, cleanse the environment, and even influence weather. The Orgone accumulator was built from alternating layers of organic and metallic materials. Reich said this arrangement gathered orgone from the surrounding environment, amplifying its effects. When people sat inside the box, they reported feeling energized, euphoric, even healed. Some cancer patients claimed remission. Others felt chronic illnesses melt away. Reich didn't stop there. He built devices he called cloudbusters, which he claimed could manipulate weather by directing orgone flows into the sky. In controlled demonstrations, he summoned rain from blue skies. Crops were saved. Droughts were interrupted. It was a radical idea that nature was not just passive, but responsive, a system of energy that could be influenced, even harmonized. But Reich's ideas flew in the face of conventional medicine and physics. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration labeled Orgone a fiction. Courts issued injunctions banning the distribution of his devices, and then came the raids. In 1956, federal agents stormed Reich's lab. They destroyed his accumulators, burned his books, incinerated years of notes and correspondence, a literal bonfire of discovery. Even scientific journals and personal letters were reduced to ash. Reich was imprisoned for contempt of court. 8 months later, he died behind bars, broken, silenced, and erased. But his legacy refused to vanish. Independent researchers, often working in obscurity, continued to test his ideas. Some found unusual heat generation inside orgone boxes. Others reported faster plant growth, improved healing in animals, and strange atmospheric effects when operating cloudbusters. These anomalies may not prove Reich's theories, but they suggest he touched something real, something misunderstood, or perhaps too far ahead of its time. Why was he silenced so forcefully? perhaps because Reich's work blurred the line between medicine, energy, and consciousness. If disease could be treated not with drugs, but with environmental energy, what would that mean for the pharmaceutical industry? If weather could be shaped not by machines, but by resonant fields, what would that mean for control? What if the natural world isn't a clockwork mechanism, but a living web of forces, and Reich simply saw it first? Today, the term Orgone is mostly dismissed as pseudoscience. Yet the questions Reich raised still linger. What unseen energies dance around us? What forces, if harnessed with care, could heal rather than harm? And how many other discoveries have been dismissed not because they failed, but because they dared to redefine what's possible? It rose from the Florida soil like a puzzle built by invisible hands. Coral Castle, a monument of impossibility, was constructed single-handedly by a man named Edward Leeds Calnan between 1923 and 1951. Using massive blocks of coral, some weighing more than 30 tons, he shaped a stone fortress complete with walls, gates, chairs, and a sundial, all without modern machinery, no cranes, no teams, no engines, just one man and a secret. Leeds Calnan was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 120 pounds. He worked alone, mostly at night. Visitors occasionally glimpsed him moving the stones, not with struggle or sweat, but with uncanny ease. Some said the rocks floated. Others claimed they moved silently, as if gravity had momentarily let go. Leeds Calnan offered only cryptic explanations. "I have discovered the secrets of the pyramids," he once said. "I know how the Egyptians built them." He spoke often of magnetic current, an invisible force he believed modern science misunderstood. His workshop was filled with homemade electrical devices, coils, pulleys, flywheels, and what looked like magnetometers of his own design. When questioned, he said little, but he left clues in stone, patterns, symbols, alignments. Some believe Coral Castle is more than a sculpture, that it's a map, a code, a message embedded in rock. After his death in 1951, government agents arrived. His tools were confiscated. His notes disappeared. His strange electrical devices vanished. What remained was the castle, mute, majestic, and still defying explanation. Modern engineers have tried to replicate his work. Using cranes and trucks, it takes teams of workers days to move similar stones, and even then the precision is lacking. At Coral Castle, some stones are balanced so perfectly they pivot with a finger's push, despite weighing thousands of pounds. How did he do it? Theories abound. Acoustic. It didn't just spin, it hovered. In the 1960s, a British engineer named John Searl unveiled a device that defied gravity and convention alike. The Searl effect generator, or SEG, looked deceptively simple, a series of magnetized rollers orbiting concentric rings. But when activated, something remarkable happened. The machine began to generate its own electricity. No fuel, no wires, just motion, smooth, silent, and self-sustaining. And then, as witnesses watched in disbelief, the entire device lifted off the ground. It hovered. The SEG, according to Searl, tapped into the dynamic interaction of magnetic fields to produce not only electricity, but anti-gravity. As the rollers moved around the rings, they induced electric current. And at a certain threshold, the entire unit would reduce its own weight to zero. In demonstrations, Searl's generators powered lights, appliances, even small buildings. More astonishingly, they levitated, rising into the air under their own power. Some accounts claim they flew miles into the sky before losing control and vanishing. To those who saw it, the implications were staggering. Unlimited clean energy. Propulsion without combustion. A single device capable of powering a city and lifting itself into orbit. but the reaction from authorities was swift and severe. In 1968, British regulators raided Searl's workshop, citing violations of electronic emissions standards. His equipment was confiscated. His research materials were destroyed. He was imprisoned, not for fraud or deception, but for operating a device that disrupted aircraft navigation systems. The message was clear: stop. Searl never fully gave up. He continued to rebuild in secret, facing repeated obstacles, legal threats, funding blocks, mysterious interference. The more he tried to share his discoveries, the more resistance he met. Skeptics dismissed his claims as fantasy, but modern magnetic theorists have begun to explore similar principles, that rotating magnetic fields can induce not just current, but inertial changes, that weight, mass, even space itself might be affected by geometry and motion. Could Searl have tapped into a field science still refuses to name? If the SEG was real, it represented not just a machine, but a revolution, one that would render fossil fuels, electric grids, and even rockets obsolete. So why was it buried? Because devices that float and power themselves don't just change industries, they erase them. The fossil fuel economy, the utility infrastructure, the aerospace sector, all would be fundamentally altered by such a machine. And revolutions, history tells us, are rarely welcomed by those in power. What if Searl's generators had been nurtured instead of destroyed? Would we now be living in cities floating silently above the earth, powered by magnetism and motion? Or has that future been grounded indefinitely? Somewhere, perhaps, the rings still spin, the fields still pulse, and the dream of flight without flame waits for a world ready to believe in it again. It didn't explode. It imploded, drawing energy inward like a whirlpool in the air. In the 1940s, Austrian inventor Viktor Schauberger unveiled an engine unlike any the world had seen. While traditional engines relied on explosive force, combustion, pressure, outward violence, Schauberger's implosion engine worked in reverse. It spiraled fluids inward, creating powerful vortexes that cooled as they accelerated, generating propulsion from harmony rather than destruction. Schauberger called it implosion technology, and to him it was not just a method of engineering, it was a philosophy, a blueprint borrowed from nature itself. He studied how trout could remain suspended in mountain streams, how tornadoes harness force, how trees pull water skyward against gravity. By mimicking these natural vortexes, Schauberger built engines that reportedly produced tremendous power with minimal input. They ran silently, cooled themselves, and emitted no pollution. The exhaust wasn't smoke or soot. It was pure, energized air and water. His most famous prototype, the Repulsine, was a disc-shaped aircraft powered by implosion. It generated lift without wings or jets. It hovered, it spun, and it stunned those who witnessed its silent, gravity-defying performance. But this was wartime. The Nazi regime took notice. Schauberger was compelled to work on secret projects for the German military, developing implosion systems for advanced aircraft. Some accounts suggest his work fed into the legendary Nazi UFO programs, disc-shaped crafts that could maneuver in ways conventional planes could not. After the war, Schauberger was captured by American intelligence. His research was seized. His notes, blueprints, and prototypes vanished into classified archives. He was later brought to the United States under the pretense of further development, but instead he was silenced, his inventions locked away under corporate contracts that stripped him of ownership and rights. He returned to Austria, disillusioned, and died shortly after, a man who had seen the future and watched it be taken. Today, elements of Schauberger's theory survive in the study of vortex dynamics and biomimicry, but mainstream science still struggles to explain how his engines achieved their effects, or whether they truly violated the laws of thermodynamics as claimed. What if the secret to clean, limitless energy wasn't in explosions but in spirals? not in domination of nature, but in imitation of its deepest rhythms. Schauberger's engines challenge us to rethink force itself, to imagine a world powered not by noise and fire, but by patterns found in seashells, galaxies, and the spiraling dance of water down a drain. If energy can be summoned through implosion, silently, cleanly, abundantly, what then are we waiting for? Or, more to the point, what forces are keeping us from remembering what nature already knows? It vanished, and then reappeared hundreds of miles away. In 1943, during the peak of World War II, the U.S. Navy launched an experiment so strange it reads like science fiction. Its aim? To make a warship invisible to radar. Its result? Something far more terrifying. The ship was the USS Eldridge. The method involved electromagnetic field manipulation, based loosely on Einstein's then unpublished unified field theory. Massive generators were installed on board, meant to warp the electromagnetic signature of the vessel and cloak it from detection. But what happened exceeded all expectations and all understanding. On October 28th, with the field activated, witnesses reported a brilliant flash of blue-green light. And then, the Eldridge was gone. Not just from sight, but from the very waters of the Philadelphia Naval Yard. Moments later, it reappeared in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away, before vanishing again and returning to Philadelphia. The teleportation, if that's what it was, lasted mere minutes, but its effects lingered for decades. Crew members emerged disoriented, some mentally broken, others physically fused into the metal structures of the ship itself. A few reportedly became unstuck in time, suffering spontaneous episodes of invisibility or fading in and out of reality. Several vanished entirely. The Navy immediately shut the experiment down. All records were classified. Personnel were reassigned or discharged. The official stance: nothing unusual happened, but whispers persisted. In the 1950s, a researcher named Dr. Morris Jessup received anonymous letters from someone claiming to be part of the experiment. The accounts matched other testimony of teleportation, time distortion, and human tragedy. Jessup's investigations were abruptly cut short. He was later found dead in his car, officially ruled a suicide. What had the Navy discovered? If the accounts are true, the Philadelphia experiment succeeded in manipulating space-time, folding it, breaching it, traveling through it. The technology was not invisibility. It was teleportation, possibly even dimensional displacement. Such capabilities would rewrite not only physics, but civilization itself. Instant transportation would dismantle every supply chain, every border, every weapon reliant on distance. Power would shift in an instant. And so, the silence. To this day, no official record of the experiment exists. The Navy denies all involvement, but fragments remain, testimonies, declassified mentions, strange gaps in ship logs. Enough to suggest something happened, something extraordinary and terrifying. What if matter can be moved not across, but through space, folding the fabric of reality like cloth? And if so, what else might lie on the other side of the fold? Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Philadelphia experiment is not the ship itself, but what it revealed. That reality, as we know it, is pliable. That space and time are not fixed boundaries, but membranes, thin, stretchable, and in rare moments, terrible. And maybe, just maybe, someone tore through and never came back. Or worse, came back changed. It began with silence. The silence that follows when a story is too dangerous to repeat. After the end of World War II, the dust settled not just over battlefields, but over laboratories, places where secrets had bloomed in the dark. In that aftermath, a pattern emerged. Breakthrough inventions, often proven and witnessed, were vanishing. Not because they failed, but because they worked too well. From Tesla's energy tower to Schauberger's vortex engine, from Rife's frequency cures to Searl's levitating generators, the common thread was not fraud but suppression, not scientific rejection but strategic containment. What united these innovations was not a shared mechanism but a shared threat to profit, to power, to the status quo. And while skeptics demanded evidence, the evidence often lay under lock and key, behind sealed patents or in the ashes of burned documents. Public records redacted, labs dismantled, lives ruined. Consider this. Over 5,000 patents remain classified under the Inventions Secrecy Act, many of them related to energy, propulsion, or communications. These aren't rumors, they're facts acknowledged by government agencies. Why the secrecy? Because technology is never just about function. It's about control. Who owns it? Who distributes it? Who profits from it? A machine that runs without fuel doesn't just change how we travel. It changes who holds the keys. And yet, throughout history, there have always been those who break from the expected, who follow curiosity wherever it leads. Sometimes they find gold. Sometimes they vanish. But always they remind us of something deeply human, the urge to understand, to unlock, to push beyond. What if we've already invented the solutions to our greatest problems, but have hidden them away? What if energy scarcity, disease, environmental collapse, the great crises of our age, persist not because we lack answers, but because those answers were buried? Buried not in myth, but in memory, in silence, in stories that sound too strange to be true, and yet refuse to die. The truth may not lie in confirming every claim or decoding in every device. It may lie in the pattern itself, in the way knowledge rises, then disappears, in the way breakthroughs are first celebrated, then erased. Because erasure is power, and remembering, truly remembering, is its greatest threat. So what happens when the forgotten is remembered, when the impossible is reconsidered? Maybe the better question is, what happens if we don't? It always ends the same way, with a locked door. Each story we've explored circles back to the same final act: erasure. The device is destroyed, the lab is dismantled, the patents are sealed. And the inventor, once on the brink of changing the world, fades into obscurity, or worse, is silenced altogether. This is not coincidence. It is pattern. The systems that govern modern life, energy, medicine, transportation, economy, are not designed to be disrupted. They are designed to persist, to preserve power where it already resides. And so anything truly revolutionary, anything that threatens to eliminate scarcity, reduce dependency, or empower the individual, becomes dangerous, not because it doesn't work, but because it might. We've seen it time and again. A ship that vanishes through time, a stone that floats at a whisper, a motor that hums on resonance, a box that heals through unseen forces. Technologies that could have dismantled entire industries if allowed to grow in the light. And yet, each time, they are cast back into shadow. But what if the shadow itself is the evidence? What if suppression is the signature of truth in disguise? This isn't about conspiracy. It's about consequence, about how human progress is not just shaped by discovery, but by permission, not just by what we can do, but by what we're allowed to do. And that's not science. That's power. Still, the echoes remain. In backyard workshops, forgotten patents, smuggled blueprints, in the quiet persistence of those who won't let go. Independent researchers, underground tinkerers, the inheritors of an invisible lineage. What if the technologies we call impossible are only waiting for us to stop asking for permission, to stop waiting for institutions to approve the future? Perhaps what we need is not another breakthrough, but the courage to remember the ones we already had. to revisit what was once real, once demonstrated, once alive, before fear, profit, or power made it disappear. Because every lost invention tells two stories, one of possibility and one of prevention. And the moment we understand both, we begin to see a third, the story still unwritten, ours. In the end, we return to the beginning, not to a machine, but to a question. What kind of world might we have built if we had followed curiosity instead of control? If we had chosen to nurture the spark of invention rather than extinguish it in fear? The 10 forgotten technologies we've explored were not myths. They were moments, flashes of insight, demonstrations of potential, each pointing to a different kind of future. One where energy flowed freely, where illness was treated with a vibration, not just pharmaceuticals, where gravity was not a barrier, but a doorway, where nature's patterns were partners, not puzzles. They remind us that the limits of what's possible are not always drawn by science, but by systems. And that progress, real progress, often moves not in straight lines, but in hidden spirals. Perhaps the most powerful force in the universe is not gravity, not electricity, not magnetism, but memory. Because memory shapes belief, and belief defines permission. If we are told that energy must be scarce, we build a world of scarcity. If we are taught that healing must be expensive, we accept suffering as cost. If we are convinced that nothing lies beyond our textbooks, we stop looking. But if even one of these inventions was real, just one, then everything changes. Not only our past, but our future. What if the boundary between science and myth is thinner than we think? What if we've already glimpsed the future, not in sci-fi films or digital dreams, but in the hands of forgotten men and women who dared to build it before we were ready? We do not present these stories as final truths. We present them as invitations to question, to explore, to remember. Because maybe the world we live in is not the one we were destined for, but the one we settled for. And maybe, just maybe, the next great leap won't come from a billion-dollar lab or a government vault. Maybe it will come from someone like Tesla, or Rife, or Schauberger, someone working quietly, listening to the patterns, watching the stars, and trusting in a truth the rest of the world has forgotten. The future is not erased. It is waiting for us to find the courage to look again, to remember what was lost, to build what was meant to be.